Okay, strap yourselves in, because today we're going deep on a book that makes a pretty out there claim.
Oh, yeah.
He says God is not something that was, but something that is to be.
Mmm.
The book is called Favored Races.
Catchy.
And let me tell you, it's not your typical beach read.
Definitely not light reading. So who's the author?
It's by a guy named James Hart.
Okay.
And get this, he actually wrote it as campaign literature for his congressional run.
Wait, what, for Congress?
Yep, in Tennessee. Can you imagine trying to explain that on the campaign trail?
I can't even, wow.
It's wild, right?
It's like part political manifesto, part philosophy textbook.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're going to try to unpack the core arguments of favored races
Okay.
and explore this whole idea of evolutionary ethics, which is basically the foundation of his whole worldview.
Sounds intense.
It is. So you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so to kick things off,
Yeah.
evolutionary ethics basically throws traditional morality right out the window. Okay, how so?
Instead of saying there's like some set of rules from a higher power,
Right.
it judges actions based only on whether they help or hinder the advancement of humanity.
So like as a species.
As a species, exactly.
Interesting. So instead of divine commandments or like universal principles,
Yeah.
he's saying we should just be guided by what's best for humanity's evolutionary future.
Exactly. And this leads him down some, let's just say, pretty controversial paths.
I bet. Like what?
Well, eugenics is a big one.
Eugenics, huh?
He's really concerned that we're weakening the human gene pool through what he calls dysgenic practices.
Dysgenic practices. What does he mean by that?
Well, he points to things like welfare programs.
Ooh.
He says that these programs actually encourage reproduction among, well, individuals he considers less capable, which he believes ultimately harms humanity's progress.
That's a pretty bold statement. So what's his solution? Well, he's not shy about advocating for some pretty radical solutions like selective breeding.
Selective breeding.
And even eugenic abortions.
Okay, now we're getting into some really controversial territory.
No kidding. And it gets even more interesting.
How so?
He goes so far as to say that both communism and capitalism are flawed.
Wow, he's really going after both sides of the political spectrum here.
Exactly. And his reasoning is that they both ignore the fundamental role of genetics in shaping societal outcomes.
So he sees them as two sides of the same coin.
Pretty odd.
Both missing the point in his view.
Exactly.
So genetics are kind of at the center of his whole worldview.
It seems that way. He puts intelligence on a real pedestal.
I'm curious, does he explain why he thinks intelligence is so crucial? Like, what's the big deal about it?
He believes that intelligence is the driving force behind, like, all of human advancement.
Okay.
You know, like solving our biggest problems.
Right.
And reaching our full potential as a species.
So it's not just about being smart. It's about intelligence being the key to, like, everything else.
It seems that way. He even ties it to morality, believe it or not.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
He basically argues that the most intelligent individuals are also the most ethically evolved.
I'm not sure I follow that.
Yeah, it's definitely a head-scratcher. It's kind of like survival of the fittest, but for morality.
Right. Survival of the most ethically fit, I guess.
Something like that.
Okay. That's definitely a unique perspective. I'm starting to see how this guy thinks.
Me too. And it all kind of leads up to, the title of the book, Favored Races.
Yeah, that's a pretty loaded title.
Yeah, and he actually lifted that phrase straight from Darwin's uncensored subtitle for Origin of Species.
No way. Really?
Seriously. I gotta admit, that title made me a little uneasy at first.
I can imagine. It definitely raises some eyebrows.
To say the least.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of one of the most controversial parts of his whole argument.
Which is?
His belief that races are inherently unequal.
Okay, now we're getting into some potentially dangerous territory.
Yeah. But to be fair, he emphasizes that this doesn't justify treating individuals unfairly based on their race.
Okay, so he's not advocating for, like, racial discrimination or anything?
Not exactly. He's more focused on identifying what he calls a superior sociobiological class.
A superior sociobiological class? What in the world does that even mean?
It's kind of a mouthful, right?
Yeah. And it sounds, well, a little elitist, to be honest.
It does. But it gets to the core of his vision for, like, the ideal society.
Okay, I'm listening.
So we're going to dive deeper into that superior sociobiological class in the next part.
All right, sounds like a good place to take a break.
Sounds good to me. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
So this superior sociobiological class, it
Yeah.
kind of ties back to his critique of existing institutions, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, he doesn't hold back at all
Not even a little.
when it comes to criticizing, the powers that be.
He goes after both the left and the right.
Oh, yeah. No one's safe from his critique.
He even compares Pat Buchanan's views to those of the KKK.
Whoa, that's a pretty harsh comparison.
It is.
Yeah.
But it shows you how far outside the mainstream he really is.
So what's his beef with Buchanan specifically?
He takes issue with Buchanan's stance on abortion
Okay.
and social welfare programs.
Got it.
He sees them as, completely counterproductive to his vision of a eugenic society.
Right, because they don't align with his idea of, promoting the best genes.
Exactly. It's almost like he's saying, look, you're both wrong.
Yeah, the whole system is messed up.
And he doesn't stop there. He rejects the divine right of kings
Okay.
and the divine right of birth.
So, any form of inherited privilege is a no-go for him.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
He believes that societal advancement hinges on recognizing and elevating individuals based on their capabilities,
Makes sense.
not their lineage or social standing.
So it's all about meritocracy for this guy.
Big time. It's a bold vision, no doubt.
It is, but I'm kind of wondering about the practicality of it all.
Oh, yeah.
How do you even begin to structure a society based solely on merit?
Right.
Especially when you think about how complex something like intelligence really is.
It's not exactly easy to measure, that's for sure.
And even if you could somehow objectively measure intelligence,
Yeah.
how do you make sure that those in power don't, rig the system to favor themselves and their kids?
That's a good point.
It seems like it could easily lead to, a new kind of aristocracy.
Yeah, just with different criteria for entry.
Exactly.
And it's interesting how this idea of meritocracy connects back to his critique of democracy, too.
Oh, yeah.
He's basically saying that leaving decisions to the masses is dangerous because, they lack the intelligence to make good judgments about complex issues.
He doesn't have a lot of faith in the average person, does he?
Not really.
Mm.
He sees democracy as inherently flawed,
Okay.
prone to manipulation, swayed by emotion rather than reason.
Which is why he compared it to a Ouija board, I guess.
That's the one.
It's a pretty bleak assessment of our current political systems.
Yeah. And his solution, rule by the intellectually elite, doesn't exactly inspire confidence either.
It does make you wonder, who gets to decide who's part of this elite?
Exactly.
And how do you make sure they don't just become, another self-serving ruling class?
Those are the big questions, right? And it's like, Hart doesn't really answer them.
He just kind of glosses over those details.
Yeah, it's almost like he's so focused on the big picture,
The grand vision of human potential
Right.
that he kind of forgets about the messy realities of, actually putting his ideas into practice.
Yeah. And his views on immigration
Oh, yeah. Those are interesting, too.
definitely fit into this whole line of thinking, right?
Definitely. He sees it as a potential threat
Hmm.
to, the intellectual and genetic makeup of the nation.
Especially immigration from what he considers, less favored races.
It's a perspective that's, it's definitely rooted in some outdated and harmful ideas about race and genetics.
For sure. It's a reminder that we need to be super careful when we're applying evolutionary concepts to, social and political issues.
Absolutely. Just because something's based in science
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's, automatically ethical or morally sound.
Well said.
So, yeah, Hart's definitely a controversial figure.
That's an understatement.
But even if you, set aside the more extreme parts of his argument,
Yeah.
there's still a lot to unpack here.
Definitely. His vision of a eugenic society raises all sorts of ethical and philosophical questions.
Yeah. And his take on religion and science
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other rabbit hole.
offers, a really fascinating but also kind of unsettling perspective on the future of humanity.
It's definitely thought-provoking, to say the least.
It is. So, you ready to dive into that?
Let's do it.
It's wild how Hart kind of blends science and religion, right?
It's a weird mix, that's for sure.
On one hand, he's totally against fundamentalist religion, calls it superstition, points to, Galileo and Bruno getting persecuted for their scientific ideas and all that.
Right.
But then he also says that atheism isn't good enough either,
Oh, yeah.
because it doesn't give you a moral framework.
So he's rejecting both traditional religion and no religion at all.
Exactly. It's he's looking for this
Yeah.
system that gets science,
Right.
but also has, a solid ethical foundation.
And that's where evolutionary ethics comes in.
That's his answer to everything.
So he thinks it solves the problems of both religion and atheism.
Pretty much. He thinks it's not just a philosophy, you know?
Right.
He thinks it's like biology, like a biological imperative.
Wow.
He thinks morality itself is a product of evolution.
Hmm.
Like, it's essential for our survival and all that.
So he's basically saying that evolution is like our guiding principle.
Kind of, yeah. It's almost like he's saying it's like a divine force or something.
It's definitely a different way of looking at things.
And it ties right back to his idea that humanity is evolving into God.
Hold on. So instead of worshiping a god out there somewhere,
Yeah,
he's saying we're becoming God.
that's the gist of it, yeah.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Right, it totally flips the script.
Totally.
He thinks that, like, through conscious effort and, yeah, through eugenics, too.
Right. Can't forget about that.
Humanity can basically transcend its current limitations, like reach this higher level of being, you know?
Like the next step in evolution.
He even uses this word Promethean
Promethean.
to describe people who buy into this whole evolutionary worldview thing.
I see. So like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods.
Exactly.
He's comparing that to people who are pushing for this new...
Yep, science-driven morality.
It's like he sees himself as leading humanity to a new era or thing.
Oh, for sure. He definitely thinks he's onto something big.
I mean, even if you ignore the eugenics stuff, it's still a lot to process.
Yeah, this whole idea that humanity is the evolving God is like...
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around.
For sure. It definitely makes you think about, like, our place in the universe in a totally different way.
And it raises all these questions about, like, good and evil and progress and our responsibility to the future and, like...
It's a lot.
It is. But maybe that's the point of this whole deep dive, right?
What do you mean?
It's not about agreeing with every crazy thing Hart says.
Right.
Or, like, endorsing his specific solutions.
Yeah.
It's about, like, grappling with the questions he raises.
I can get behind that.
You know, like, questions that make us think about human nature, and morality, and what kind of future we want.
It's about challenging our own assumptions about all that stuff.
Exactly. And realizing that our choices, like both individually and as a society, have huge consequences down the line.
That's a good takeaway. It's like the story of humanity is still being written, you know?
It is. And, as Hart says, perhaps God is the one who can ask the question, what is God?
That's deep, man.
Right. So if we're all, like, part of this evolving God thing, what kind of God do we want to be?
That's the question, isn't it?
What values should guide us?
And what are we going to leave behind for the next generation?
Those are the big questions we all got to wrestle with, I think.
I think you're right.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride.
It was definitely a trip.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a source that's sure to challenge your thinking. Until then, keep those minds open and keep questioning everything.